The auctioneer's hammer had never once come down against Dexter Fletcher, not in 6 years of cattle auctions across the Texas panhandle, and every man in Caldwell County knew it. But on a blazing Thursday morning in the summer of 1878, a woman in a sun-faded calico dress raised her hand and changed everything. The town of Redemption, Texas sat at the edge of nowhere and the beginning of something. A dusty collection of timber-framed buildings pressed against the flat earth like they were afraid the wind might carry them off. The Kishom Trail ran not 30 miles to the east, and the cattle trade had made certain men wealthy and certain men desperate, sometimes within the same season. Redemption had grown up fast in the years after the war, the kind of town that sprouted saloons before it sprouted churches, and drew the ambitious alongside the broken, the honest alongside the crooked. By the summer of 1878, it was a town of nearly 400 souls, complete with a general store, a blacksmith, a sheriff's office that saw more use than anyone wished, and a livestock auction yard at the southern edge of town that smelled of dry grass, animal sweat, and money. Dexter Fletcher had ridden into Redemption 3 years earlier with nothing but a bedroll, a good horse, a reputation for honesty, and a natural gift for reading cattle the way some men read books. He was 31 years old that summer, tall and lean with sun-dark skin and dark brown eyes that moved slowly and deliberately over everything they surveyed, as if he were always appraising, always deciding what something was worth. He had built himself up from hired hand to ranch foreman to, finally, the owner of the modest but growing arrowhead spread 5 miles south of town. He raised beef cattle and a small string of horses, and he attended every auction in Caldwell County not just to buy stock, but because the auction yard was where deals were truly made, where information traveled, where a man could take the temperature of an entire region in the span of a single afternoon. He had never lost an auction bid. Not because he always bid highest, he was too careful with money for that, but because he read the room with uncanny precision. He knew when a man was bluffing, knew when a rancher was desperate enough to fold, knew exactly how far to push and when to let a thing rest. It had become something of a legend in Redemption, the quiet certainty of Dexter Fletcher standing at auction. Annie Carver arrived in Redemption on the 16th of June, 1878, on the afternoon stage from Abilene. She was 26 years old, and she had the kind of self-possession that made people look twice, not because of beauty alone, though she was striking, with dark auburn hair and clear green eyes that caught light the way creek water catches sunlight, but because she carried herself as though she had already survived the worst thing the world could offer and had decided to keep going anyway. She had. Her husband, James Carver, had died of a fever the previous autumn, leaving her with a quarter section of land just north of Redemption, a half-built house, 40 head of longhorn cattle, and a debt to the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell County that came due in 8 months. He had also left her a 7-year-old son named Charlie, a boy with his father's quiet seriousness and his mother's stubbornness. Annie had grown up on a farm in Missouri, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. She understood hard work. She understood cattle better than most women in 1878 were expected to, better than several men she had met, and she had spent the winter after James's death learning everything she could about the county she now found herself rooted in. She had written letters. She had read newspapers. She had spoken at length with her nearest neighbor, a weathered widow named Mabel Foss who had been ranching alone for 12 years, and whose weathered competence Annie found more reassuring than anything else Redemption had offered her. What Annie needed, that summer of 1878, was a bull. One good, strong, quality Hereford bull that could improve her small herd over the next 2 years, giving her calves with more weight and better prices at market. Without that, her 40 longhorns would produce mediocre calves at best, and mediocre calves would not pay off the banknote. She had been saving since January, setting aside every penny from the sale of winter hides, from taking in mending work, from 2 months of teaching the Foss children their letters in exchange for labor on her fence line. She had $340 saved. She had done her research. A good Hereford bull at auction in the summer of 1878 would go for somewhere between $250 and $350, depending on the bloodline and the competition. It was a narrow margin, and she knew it. She arrived at the Redemption Livestock Auction on the morning of the 19th of June with Charlie at her side, and $340 folded into an envelope inside the pocket of her calico dress. She wore the dress she reserved for town. It was blue with small white flowers, and it had been mended twice at the collar, and she had her auburn hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat that had seen better decades. Charlie wore his good shirt and held his mother's hand until they reached the fence of the auction yard, where the smell of cattle hit him like a wave, and he pressed his face against the rails with the pure joy of a boy who had grown up around animals. The yard was crowded. There were perhaps 60 men present, ranchers and foremen and buyers from as far as the Red River, along with a scattering of wives who had come to watch rather than participate. Annie Carver was the only woman present who stood with her own paddle and her own intentions. She noticed immediately how the men registered this. Some glanced away with studied disinterest. Some let their eyes linger with curiosity. A very few, were openly dismissive, the kind of men who would have smiled at her if she were selling baked goods at a church social, but felt the presence of a woman at a cattle auction to be a mild disruption of the natural order. Annie noticed all of it and chose to care about none of it. She was here for the bull. She did not notice Dexter Fletcher at first because he was standing at the back of the crowd, slightly apart from the main cluster of men, watching the first 2 lots of steers move through the yard with the patient attention of a man who is not interested in what is currently being sold, but is interested in everything else. He saw her arrive. He saw Charlie press his face against the fence. He saw the envelope she touched once through the fabric of her pocket, the small, unconscious gesture of someone checking that something important is still there. He noted her paddle number 47 and went back to watching the steers. The Hereford bull came up as the 9th lot of the morning. He was a fine animal, 3 years old and well-muscled, with a broad chest and the calm, square-headed placidity of a Hereford in good health. He was exactly what Annie needed. She could see it in the depth of his chest, in the solid way he stood without being fractious, in the quality of his coat. Her pulse went up a beat and she steadied it. Roy Duggan opened the bidding at $150. Roy Duggan was the auctioneer, a barrel-chested man with a voice like a trombone, and he moved lots through with efficient cheerfulness, never lingering too long on any one animal. Several hands went up. The bidding moved quickly to 200, then 230, then 250. Some paddles went down. By 270 there were 3 bidders left. A tall man in a black hat whose name Annie did not know, a red-faced rancher from the north end of the county named Harmon Cole who smelled of tobacco and spoke too loudly, and Annie herself. She bid 280. Harmon Cole glanced at her with open surprise, then laughed once, a short, dismissive sound, and bid 290. The man in the black hat bid 300. Annie bid 310. She was aware of a shift in the crowd now, a change in the quality of attention around her, as if the air itself had become interested. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. She kept her eyes on the bull and her face composed and her paddle in her hand. Harmon Cole muttered something under his breath and lowered his paddle. He was out. The man in the black hat bid 320. Annie bid 330. She was $10 from her absolute limit. She felt it in her chest like a stone, that number, 340, the hard ceiling of what she had, and she did not look away from the bull. The man in the black hat studied her for a long moment. She noticed peripherally that he was watching her differently than the others had, not dismissively, not with amusement. He was watching her the way she watched a piece of land before she decided whether to put a fence post in it, steadily, with genuine assessment. He bid 340. Her stomach dropped. She stood very still. The crowd waited. Roy Duggan's voice rolled over them. 340. Do I hear 350? 340 going once. Annie raised her paddle. $345, she said clearly, and the yard went quiet enough that she heard a horse shift its weight 30 feet away. She had lied about her limit by $5. She had exactly $340, not $345. She had made the bid on pure nerve, watching the man in the black hat, watching the slight change in his posture as her paddle went up, not knowing what it meant, not knowing anything at all except that she had not come this far to lose by $10. The man in the black hat was Dexter Fletcher, and in the span of a single breath he decided to lose. He lowered his paddle. He did not know why, exactly, in the way a person does not always know the precise moment they cross a threshold until they look back at it later. He knew the bull was worth more than $345. He knew he could afford $360 without difficulty. He knew that Harmon Cole would have driven that animal home, bred it for 2 seasons, and sold it to a meat buyer without ever understanding what he had. He looked at the woman in the faded blue dress with the envelope in her pocket, the woman who had outbid 3 men on nerve alone, the woman whose boy had his face pressed against the fence rail, and he put his paddle down. Roy Duggan's hammer came down. Sold. To number 47, $345. The crowd absorbed this with the low murmur that follows any unexpected result, and Annie Carver walked to the payment table with her spine straight and her face composed and her heart hammering. She paid $340. She told the clerk it was $345 and that she would bring the remaining $5 to the office before sundown, and she did so with a calm certainty that left no room for the clerk to argue. She wondered, walking to the gate where her new bull was being led out by a yard hand, whether the man in the black hat had simply reached his own limit. She told herself this was the most likely explanation. Men had limits. Auctions were unpredictable. She had been lucky, and she was grateful for it, and she needed to arrange a way to get this animal 5 miles north to her land before noon. She did not look for the man in the black hat again. But Dexter Fletcher was watching her from the edge of the crowd as she crouched beside her son and pointed out the bull's strong shoulders, explaining something to the boy in a low, patient voice, and Charlie Carver nodded with the gravity of a child taking in important information. Dexter watched them for a long moment, and then he felt something settle in his chest that he had not expected, something quiet and warm and vaguely alarming, and he put his hat back on and went to buy the 2 steers he had actually come to purchase. He was standing at the payment table when Annie Carver returned 3 hours later with a $5 bill folded very precisely in her fingers. "Excuse me," she said to the clerk, and laid the bill on the counter. "For lot 9. I was short when I paid this morning. There it is, with apologies for the delay." The clerk took the bill and gave her a receipt, and she turned to go, and that was when she found Dexter Fletcher standing directly in her path. He stepped aside immediately, touching the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said. "Sir," she said. They looked at each other for approximately 2 seconds, and she had the sudden, clear, unsettling impression that he knew. She did not know how he could know, that she had bid higher than she had the money for, that she had bluffed on nerve and luck and the pure desperate hope that he would back down. But something in his dark, steady eyes held a quality she could not quite name, and it sat in her chest like a warm coal all the way home. She told herself this was nonsense. She told herself she had more important things to think about. She was right about the second part. She was wrong about the first. The summer of 1878 moved forward in the way summers in the Texas Panhandle always did, with heat that arrived early in the morning and did not relent until well after dark, with the dry grass turning from gold to the brittle color of old bone, with the cattle moving slowly in the afternoons, and the windmill on Annie's land working steadily to pull water from the ground. She had named the windmill James, in a private act of sentiment she would not have admitted to anyone. She talked to it sometimes when Charlie was asleep, small practical conversations about fence posts and cattle weight, and whether the sky in the northwest had the look of weather in it. The Hereford bull, whom Charlie had immediately named captain on account of a particular commanding quality in his bearing, settled into the Carver herd with the ease of an animal that understood his purpose. Annie watched the cows moving around him with professional satisfaction and calculated timelines in her head before sleep. If the breeding went well, she would have calves on the ground by late spring. By the following summer, she would have something to sell. The banknote came due in February. She had until then to make a partial payment, enough to extend the loan, and she was going to do it. She had also noticed that her south fence line, which ran along the boundary of what she had been told was a property belonging to a rancher named Fletcher, needed significant repair. 3 posts were rotted through, and a section of wire had gone slack enough that a determined heifer could push through without much effort. She could not afford to lose any animals through that fence, and she could not afford to hire help to fix it. She went out one morning in early July with a post-hole digger, a bag of nails, and Charlie, who was old enough to hold things and pass tools and take directions seriously. She was 2 hours into the work, with 1 post replaced and perspiration darkening the back of her shirt, when she heard a horse and looked up to find a man on a sorrel gelding picking his way along the fence line from the south. He drew up at a respectful distance and dismounted, and she recognized him at the same moment she had not let herself think about since the auction yard. Dexter Fletcher carried his hat in one hand and looked at the fence, and then at her. "That's my fence line too," he said, not accusingly, simply stating a fact. "I know it," Annie said. "I was going to replace what's mine. I wasn't planning to touch your posts." "The slack wire is pulling from my side," he said. He walked to the fence and crouched, examining it, then stood up and looked at her. "I've got staples and a wire puller in my saddlebag. It'll go faster with 2. Annie looked at him steadily. "I'm Annie Carver," she said. "I own the quarter section north of here." "I know it," he said, with the faintest possible echo of her own words back at her. "I'm Dexter Fletcher. I own the Arrowhead. Glad to meet you, Mrs. Carver." "Miss Carver," she said. "My husband passed last autumn." "I heard that," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for your loss." It was said simply and without performance, and she believed it. "Thank you," she said. Charlie appeared from around the fence post with a hammer in both hands, looked at the horse, looked at the man, and said, "That's a good sorrel." "He knows it," Dexter said, and there was warmth in his voice that he did not seem to be performing either. "You know horses." "I know cattle better," Charlie said seriously. "But I know horses some. My mama says you have to know both." "Your mama's right," Dexter said, and looked at Annie with a directness she found difficult to categorize. They fixed the fence together that morning, and it took 2 hours less than it would have taken Annie alone. He worked without making it a performance, without directing her or taking over her tasks, simply working alongside her with a practical efficiency that she found unexpectedly easy to match. Charlie handed tools to both of them impartially and asked Dexter questions about cattle with such relentless specific curiosity that Annie finally told him to let the man work in peace. "No, let him ask," Dexter said. "Better for a boy to be curious than not." By the time the fence was done, they were dusty and warm, and Annie had accepted the small canteen of water he offered without embarrassing herself about it, and Charlie had extracted from Dexter a comprehensive account of the Arrowhead's cattle-rearing practices that lasted the entire walk back along the fence line. At his horse, Dexter paused. "Mrs. Carver," he said, and caught himself. "Miss Carver, I hear you've got a good Hereford bull." Her eyes met his, and there it was again, that quality she could not name, that warmth without agenda, that steadiness. "I do," she said. "Charlie named him Captain." "That's a serious name for a bull," Dexter said. "He's a serious bull," Charlie said earnestly. Dexter laughed, and it was a full, real sound, and Annie found it difficult not to smile in return. He put his hat on and swung up onto the sorrel and touched the brim. "If you need anything from the Arrowhead, Miss Carver, I hope you'll ask. Good neighbors are worth more than good fences." "I'll remember that," she said. She watched him ride south along the fence line and told herself the warmth in her chest was simply the satisfaction of a morning's work done well. She was getting better at telling herself useful things. She was not yet very good at believing them. The summer moved. Annie worked. She hired a Mexican hand named Eduardo for 3 weeks to help with the hay cutting, a young man who worked hard and sang in Spanish while he worked, and never said anything that was not worth saying. She patched the roof on the barn with shingles she split herself, and nearly fell off twice in the process. She drove Captain in with the cows and watched the breeding with practical satisfaction. She took Charlie to town on Saturdays and listened to him describe Dexter Fletcher's cattle management theories to Mabel Foss with complete earnestness, while Mabel looked at Annie over the boy's head with an expression of transparent amusement. "He's been by twice to check on the fence," Annie told Mabel, in a tone intended to convey that this was purely a matter of property maintenance. "Has he?" Mabel said. "There was a post on his side that needed attention." "Mum, he is a good neighbor, Mabel, that's all." "Of course it is," Mabel said, and went back to drinking her coffee with the serene expression of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize what she was looking at. The second time Dexter came by the Carver spread, he brought a haunch of venison wrapped in cloth and left it at her door with a note that said simply, "Good hunting weather. Arrowhead had more than needed. D. Fletcher." She stared at the note for an unguarded moment before folding it and putting it in the pocket of her apron, and she cooked the venison that evening with dried onions and a handful of wild sage, and it was the best meal she and Charlie had eaten in 2 months. The third time, she saw him riding the northern boundary of her property from a distance, and when she walked out he waved and kept going, and she understood he was checking the fence again, from his side, because that was what a careful rancher did, and the fact that he always seemed to check it on mornings when she happened to be working in the north pasture could not be intentional because she never mentioned her schedule to anyone. She returned to her work and felt the warmth in her chest with considerably more attention than before, and did not make any useful statements to herself at all. The fourth time, he asked if he could come in. It was an August evening, the sky going enormous and gold over the panhandle, and Charlie was inside at the table working through the arithmetic problems Annie set him each week. Dexter rode up and dismounted and stood at the porch step with his hat in his hands in exactly the posture of a man who has been rehearsing something. "Miss Carver," he said, "I wonder if you'd allow me to take supper in town with you and your boy sometime, not any particular evening." "Whenever it might be convenient." Annie looked at him. She looked at the hat in his hands. She looked at the honest plane of his face in the last of the evening light. "That's a formal request," she said. "I mean it formally," he said. "I'm not a man who makes this kind of request without meaning it." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, through the open window, she could hear Charlie's pencil moving on paper. "Saturday," she said. "Charlie likes to go to town on Saturdays." The look on his face was not triumphant. It was something quieter and more genuine than that, something that reminded her in a way that surprised her of the look on James's face when she had first told him she loved him, that quality of a man unexpectedly made glad. She was not ready for the comparison, and she looked away briefly at the gold horizon. "Saturday," Dexter said. "I'll be grateful." He came on Saturday. He was clean and had clearly made an effort with his shirt, and Charlie greeted him at the porch with the information that Captain had eaten Mabel Foss's hat when she left it on the fence last Tuesday, and Dexter received this news with complete gravity, before breaking into a smile that Annie had to look away from because it did something to her breathing that she found inconvenient. They walked to town in the long evening light, Charlie between them chattering about cattle, and they ate at the Red Garter's public dining room, which served the best beef stew in Redemption, and had checked tablecloths that made the whole room feel almost civilized. The conversation over supper was easy in a way Annie had not expected. Dexter talked about the Arrowhead, about the years before it, about the time he had spent as a drover on the Kishom Trail in his early 20s when driving cattle north to Abilene had been the primary way a young man with ambition and no family connections could make himself something. He talked about it without romanticism, describing the trail as the thing it was, dusty and dangerous and often lonely, a proving ground rather than an adventure, with storms and rivers and the constant calculation of distances and water. He had saved for 7 years to have enough to start. He had not wasted a year of the saving. Annie listened and found herself respecting the architecture of his life, the way he had built it deliberately and without shortcuts. She talked about Missouri, about the farm where she had grown up, about the way her father had taught her to read cattle on the hoof the same way he taught her to read a Bible, with attention and patience, and the understanding that both were documents that rewarded careful study. She had married James Carver at 21 and come to Texas at 23, and she had loved the land from the first day she saw it, the enormous open indifference of it, the way it asked nothing from you and gave nothing back without effort. Most people find that frightening, Dexter said. I found it honest, Annie said. He looked at her with that steady dark gaze, and she felt it like the sun coming through a window in winter, direct and warm and unwilling to be ignored. Charlie had fallen half asleep over the remains of his pie, and they walked home in the dark with Charlie holding Annie's hand on one side and Dexter's on the other, because Charlie had simply taken his hand without asking and Dexter had accepted this with a naturalness that made something ache in Annie's chest in the most complicated possible way. At the door she said thank you. Dexter said the pleasure had been entirely his, and he said it with a simple directness that made it into something more than courtesy, and then he was gone into the dark on his sorrel horse, and Annie stood on the porch for a long time after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, breathing the warm night air and trying to understand what was happening to her carefully maintained plans. She had not planned for this. She had planned for the bull and the calf crop and the bank note. She had planned for the fence and the hay and the roof. She had allowed herself to plan as far forward as the following February, which was when the loan payment was due, and not much further, because the future beyond that had felt too uncertain to look at directly. She had not planned for a tall man with quiet eyes who lost an auction bid she had been transparently unable to afford, and who fixed fences and left venison and took her boy's hand in the dark without being asked. She was not certain when she had become aware that he had let her win that auction. It had not come to her in a single moment but in accumulation, the way understanding usually arrives, a little at a time, building until it was too solid to question. It was the way he had looked at her when she bluffed the final bid, that particular quality of attention that was not the look of a man who had reached his limit, but the look of a man who had made a decision. It was the way he had said 340 going once, and she had seen his paddle hand move, not to raise, but to lower. It was the $5 she had brought back to the auction clerk, and the way he had been standing at the payment table when she returned, and the calm, unconcerned expression on his face that was, she had since concluded, slightly too calm to be natural. He had let her win. He had lost on purpose, and nobody knew it but her, and she was not entirely certain that he knew she knew. She held this knowledge carefully, the way she held anything that mattered. She did not bring it up. She was not ready to bring it up. She needed to understand what it meant to him and what it meant to her, and whether either of those things was something she could afford to examine too closely, given the bank note and the calf crop and the very great uncertainty of her situation. But it changed things, the knowing. It changed the quality of how she thought about him, the texture of it. A man could lower his paddle for any number of reasons: gallantry, foolishness, attraction, pity. She did not want his pity, and she was honest enough with herself to examine the possibility clearly and honestly decide it was not that. Whatever it had not been pity. She had looked into his face and she knew the difference. The summer deepened into September, and September brought with it the first cool nights and a shift in the grass that signaled the coming of autumn. And Dexter Fletcher came by the Carver spread on a Tuesday evening with the news that there was a second auction in October, a larger one at the county seat in Caldwell, where he was planning to buy 2 breeding heifers, and wondered if she would like to ride along with him and Charlie in his wagon, as the distance was 20 miles and the road was better in company. Annie said yes. She said it before she had finished thinking about it, which told her something. They rode to Caldwell on a cool October morning, with Charlie in the wagon bed, pointing out every hawk and antelope he spotted and announcing them like a town crier. Dexter drove with the easy competence of a man who had been handling horses since childhood, and Annie sat beside him on the bench seat, and they talked, actually talked, the way people do when they have decided, mutually and without discussion, that they trust each other. She told him about the bank note and the timeline, not as a confession but as a fact, because she was a practical woman, and she did not see the point in concealing the shape of her situation from a man whose opinion she had begun to value. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "You'll make it," he said. "I intend to," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I've been watching your operation since June. You're managing that spread better than men with twice the experience and 3 times the land." She looked at him. "You've been watching my operation." He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I'm a neighbor, neighbors watch. For 3 months. I'm a thorough neighbor," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, and she laughed before she could stop herself. A genuine unguarded sound, and the hawk Charlie had just spotted went unannounced because the boy was staring at his mother with wide eyes as if he had never heard her laugh like that before. Perhaps he had not. She thought about that for a while, watching the horizon. The Caldwell auction was a large affair, with buyers from as far as Fort Worth and a range of stock that made the redemption yard look modest. Annie did not bid on anything. She had not come to buy, she had come to learn, and she moved through the crowd taking in prices and bloodlines and the way experienced buyers talked to each other, filing everything away with methodical attention. Dexter bought his 2 heifers at fair prices, and over the midday meal he introduced her to 3 other ranchers in terms that were simply matter of fact. Annie Carver. She runs the Carver quarter section north of Redemption, good Hereford breeding operation. Not as a widow, not as a woman, simply as a rancher. She noticed this. She appreciated it more than she was willing to say. On the drive home, Charlie fell asleep in the wagon bed before they had covered 5 miles, wrapped in a blanket against the October chill, and the road stretched ahead in the late gold light, and Dexter drove and Annie sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while, but it was the particular silence of 2 people who are comfortable together, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "You can ask," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. The auction in June. The Hereford bull. The warmth hit her chest before he even finished the sentence. She kept her face composed. "What about it?" "You bid $345, he said. "I did," she said carefully. "You came back that afternoon with $5. His voice was even without accusation. "You were short." "I was," she said. "I settled the debt." "You bluffed," he said. "It was not a question. You were at your limit and you bluffed." She looked at him now directly and found him already looking at her, the reins easy in his hands, the sorrel gelding picking its own way along the rutted road. "I had to try," she said. He was quiet again. The wagon rolled. Somewhere behind them, Charlie sighed in his sleep. "You let me win," she said, and her voice was steady and certain. "I've known it since July. You could have bid $350 and I was finished. You put your paddle down on purpose." He looked back at the road. A muscle moved in his jaw. "You deserved that bull," he said. "That's not how auctions work," she said, but gently. "No," he agreed. "It's not." "Why?" she asked. The question was simple and direct, and she meant it simply and directly, and she watched him think about the answer with the same deliberateness he brought to everything else, that unhurried quality that she had initially misread as slowness and had long since understood was the opposite. "I've bid at every auction in this county for 3 years. he said. "I've watched men bid against each other over animals and over pride and over nothing at all. I've never seen a woman stand at that fence with her own paddle and her own money and read a bull the way you read that one." He paused. "And then you bluffed on pure nerve with $5 you didn't have, and something about that—" He stopped again. "What?" she said quietly. "Seemed like it should be rewarded," he said. It was not quite the whole truth, she suspected, but it was as much of it as he could currently put into language, and she understood this about him now, that he was honest but slow with the most personal things, that he moved toward truth the way he moved toward everything, deliberately, without wasted motion, making sure of the ground before he put his weight on it. "It was a risky thing to do," she said, "letting the bid go." "It was," he agreed. "It cost you a good bull." "It did." "Was it worth it?" she asked, and she was not asking about the bull. He turned to look at her then fully, and in the October light his face was open in a way she had not seen before, all the careful composure of it gone for a moment. "Yes," he said, simply, completely. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back at the road, and she was doing something she had not done with her face in the presence of another adult since before James died, something that felt like the careful lowering of a guard she had not known she had kept up for so long. "You should have bid $350, she said, "and let me find another way." "Maybe," he said, "but I didn't want to." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Charlie slept in the wagon bed, and the evening star appeared above the horizon, and Dexter Fletcher drove his wagon home through the October dusk. And somewhere along the 20 miles of road between Caldwell and Redemption, his hand moved from the reins and rested on the bench seat between them, simply rested there. And Annie looked at it for a moment, and then placed her own hand beside it so that their fingers were almost touching but not quite. And that was enough for now, and they both knew it was enough. And they drove the rest of the way home in the particular silence of two people who have arrived at something. October became November. The first hard frost arrived, and Annie drove the cattle to the winter pasture and stacked hay with Eduardo's help for the final time before he took work at a larger spread for the winter. The calves that Captain would produce would not arrive until spring. The bank note was due in February, and she had managed, through relentless careful management of every dollar and every resource, to save $200 toward the interest payment, which would be enough to extend the loan for another 6 months if the bank agreed. She had written to the banker, a man named Pritchard, with a detailed accounting of her breeding program and her projected spring earnings, and Pritchard had written back with the condescending brevity of a man who did not expect to take her projections seriously, but was obligated to acknowledge them. Dexter knew about the bank note and the letter and the payment. She had told him in the straightforward way she had come to tell him most things, because withholding information from him felt dishonest rather than private, a distinction she had not expected to feel with anyone other than James. He had offered to help financially, once, in a single careful sentence, and she had said no, thank you, with a firmness that left no room for revisiting, and he had nodded and not mentioned it again, and the respect implicit in that not mentioning had meant more to her than any amount of money. November brought something else: Harmon Cole. Harmon Cole was the red-faced rancher who had been at the auction in June, the one who had bid against her on the Hereford bull and dropped out at $290. He was also, as Annie had learned in the intervening months, a man who had been making slow, unwelcome progress toward acquiring the smaller spreads along the North County boundary, buying out struggling homesteaders at distressed prices when the bank called their notes early. He owned 9 sections of land already, and he wanted more, and he had heard through channels that Annie could not quite identify but suspected involved the banker Pritchard, that the Carver Quarter section might be available. He came by on a cold November morning with his hat pushed back on his head and his horse steaming in the frost, and he sat his horse at her fence and said he understood she was in a difficult position financially and that he was prepared to offer her a fair price for the property. Annie stood on her porch with her arms crossed and said she was not selling. He said the bank note was due in February. She said she was aware of that. He said a woman alone with a boy and 40 head of cattle in a panhandle, winter, had a hard road ahead of her. She said she had been managing her hard road without his opinion so far. He looked at her with the patient, almost pleasant expression of a man who is certain the word no is a temporary position. "I'll come back in January," he said, "when you've had time to think it over." "Come back in never," Annie said, and went inside. She told Dexter about it the following Saturday when he came by with Charlie's promised visit to see the Arrowhead horses. She told him in the same practical way she told him everything, watching his face for the reaction, and what she saw was not anger, or not only anger, but a particular cold quality that moved behind his eyes briefly before he controlled it. "He's been doing this for 2 years, Dexter said. "Picking off the small spreads when the bank leans on them. Pritchard sends him the names," Annie said. It was a conclusion she had reached without being able to prove it, but she felt the truth of it. "Most likely," Dexter agreed. "Did he threaten you?" "Nothing direct, just the suggestion that I'm in a precarious position." "You are in a precarious position," Dexter said, and she appreciated that he said it plainly rather than pretending otherwise. "That doesn't mean you have to sell to Harmon Coal." "I know it," she said. "I'm not going to sell to Harmon Coal." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you will." There was a moment between them then, charged with something she recognized, and had been finding more and more difficult to look at sideways. And Charlie appeared from the direction of the barn, having found a cat, which he was carrying in both arms with the triumphant expression of a boy who has solved a problem. And the moment dissolved into a discussion of whether the cat lived at the Arrowhead or was a visitor. And Dexter said the cat's name was Colonel, and he had been living at the Arrowhead for 3 years and was not a visitor. Charlie said that Captain and Colonel should meet. Dexter said that was a terrible idea. Annie looked at Dexter across her son's head and felt something in her chest that she had been naming practical warmth and neighborly regard and appreciation for his steadiness, felt it shift and settle into something that she finally admitted, on a cold November night with the wind pushing at the walls of the half-built house, was love. She did not say it. She was not ready to say it. She had been a widow for 14 months, and she was practical about her own feelings the way she was practical about everything else, and she knew that love at the wrong time in the wrong circumstances was as dangerous as a post hole in a dark pasture. She was going to get through February first. December came in cold and dry, and on the 15th of December, Dexter Fletcher showed up at her door on a Sunday morning with his hat in his hands again, and she recognized the posture and the look on his face, and she told Charlie to go check on Captain. And Charlie, who had developed an excellent understanding of adult body language, went without argument. Dexter came inside and stood in her small front room, which had a fire going and James's photograph on the mantel and the arithmetic papers scattered on the table, and he looked at all of it without apology, and then he looked at her. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you for approximately 4 months, he said. "That's a long time to think," she said. "I think thoroughly," he said, and she saw the flash of self-awareness in it. "You do," she agreed. "Annie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice did something to her that she had stopped pretending it wouldn't. "I would like to court you properly, with your full understanding of what I mean by that. I'm not a man who does things halfway, and I'm not making this request without a serious intention behind it. I understand your situation. I understand that you have a son and a spread and a banknote and a full life that doesn't require me in it. I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze with that particular steadiness of his that she had come to depend on the way she depended on the windmill, not dramatically, but absolutely. "When I bid against you at the June auction," she said, "I didn't know who you were." "I know," he said, "and you let me win anyway, without knowing anything about me. I knew you read that bull correctly and you had nerve enough to bluff when you were out of money," he said. That seemed like sufficient information to begin with. She was quiet again, and he waited, and the fire popped and the wind moved outside, and in the distance she could hear Charlie talking to Captain in the low, serious voice he used for important cattle-related conversations. "Dexter," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to get through this bank note myself. I need you to understand that clearly." "I understand it clearly," he said. "I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'm going to ask a great deal of you in the way of patience, because I am careful with the things I care about, and I care about this." "I'm a patient man," he said. "You are," she agreed. "I've noticed." She moved toward him then, just slightly, just enough, and he understood the movement and closed the remaining distance between them and took both her hands in his, and that was all, just that. But the warmth of it moved through her like sun through the window in winter, and she understood that she had already decided, long before this moment, and the decision felt like the most solid ground she had stood on in years. "Yes," she said, "you may court me." The smile on his face was not the private, controlled expression she had seen him use in public. It was full and unguarded, and it made him look younger, and she filed it away in the place where she kept the things that mattered. They were proper about it. They were deliberate and careful and genuinely courting, rather than performing courtship, which meant long conversations on her porch in the December cold about their respective philosophies of land management and their opinions of Reconstruction politics, and whether Charlie's interest in cattle was going to develop into the career he already seemed to be planning for himself at age 7. Dexter brought her books when he came to town, and she returned them with her opinions written in the margins, and he read her opinions with an attention that she found profoundly satisfying. He did not tell her she was wrong. On 2 occasions she was wrong, and he said so plainly, and she respected him for it. He did not kiss her until January, and when he did it was on the Carver porch on a Sunday evening with the panhandle stars enormous overhead and Charlie long since asleep, and it was careful and deliberate and unmistakably sincere, and she understood that she had been waiting for exactly that particular quality of certainty and found it here in this. January was also the month that Harmon Cole came back. He arrived on a Tuesday with a formal offer in writing, forwarded through the banker Pritchard, for a sum that was technically fair market value for the Carver property, but that Annie suspected was deliberately timed to arrive at the moment of maximum pressure, 12 days before her February note was due. She read the offer with complete calm and set it on the table and went back to her accounts. She had $220. She needed $230 to make the minimum payment Pritchard had agreed would extend the loan. She was $10 short. She sat with this for 2 days without telling anyone, doing the arithmetic in every direction she could find, and she could not make it come out differently. She had already sold the 2 hides she had saved. She had nothing left that could be converted to cash quickly except for 1 young heifer that she could not afford to sell because she needed the animal for spring breeding, or a saddle that had been James's and that she had been keeping for Charlie. On the 3rd day, a Wednesday morning, Mabel Foss arrived at her door with a crock of rendered lard and a bag of dried beans, and without preamble, pressed $11 into Annie's hand. "I won't hear a word about it," Mabel said. "You'll pay me back in spring. I have it to spare and you have need of it. That's all there is to it." Annie looked at the money in her hand and at the weathered face of the woman who had been a neighbor to her for 14 months with an undemanding steadiness that was its own form of love. "Thank you, Mabel," she said. "Don't thank me," Mabel said. "Write your check to Pritchard and deliver it before he changes his mind." She did. She delivered the payment on the 1st of February and sat across from Pritchard in his office and watched him verify the amount and issue the extension with the particular sourness of a man whose plans have been slightly disrupted. The extension was for 6 months, which would take her to August, by which time she would have calves on the ground and Hereford crosses at market. Walking out of the bank in the February sunlight, Annie Carver felt the ground under her feet as solid as it had ever been, and she thought about the bull and the auction, and the $5 she had not had, and the man who had put his paddle down, and she understood that the architecture of this moment had begun there, in that single decision, and she was profoundly grateful for it. Dexter was waiting outside because she had told him where she was going, and he had said he would be in town that morning as a matter of coincidence that was transparently not a coincidence. He read her face and broke into his full, unguarded smile. "Extension," he said. "6 months," she said. He took her hand, right there on the main street of Redemption in front of anyone who happened to be watching, and she let him, and she squeezed his fingers, and they stood in the February sunshine, and she was, for the first time in what felt like years, completely all right. The spring of 1879 was the finest Annie Carver had experienced since coming to Texas. March brought rain, and the rain brought green grass pushing up through the bleached winter mat, and the cattle moved to the fresh growth with their particular urgent enthusiasm, and by April there were 17 calves on the ground, 12 of them Hereford crosses by Captain, and every one of them was exactly what Annie had needed them to be: broad-chested, thick-shouldered, quietly powerful little animals with the gentle dispositions of their father. Charlie named all 17 of them. He kept a written list in a small notebook that he carried in his shirt pocket, and he would add notes after visiting each animal. Annie read the notes when he was asleep and found them to be a combination of practical cattle observation and character analysis that struck her as, in some ways, already better than what she saw from grown ranchers at auction. Dexter came for supper 3 evenings a week through the spring and stayed for the long, warm evenings on the porch while Charlie sat between them doing his arithmetic or reading aloud from the primer Annie was working through with him. And the 3 of them had developed, without discussion, the easy rhythms of a household that was in the process of becoming something. Dexter never pushed. He was present and steady and clear about what he wanted, and he let Annie move at her own speed, which she continued to appreciate with an intensity that was its own answer to the question she had been circling for months. One evening in May, after Charlie was asleep, Dexter put down the book he'd been reading and looked at her with that directness she had learned to receive rather than deflect. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it only when you're ready and not before." "All right," she said. "Annie," he said, "I'm 32 years old, and I have never in my life wanted to build something with another person the way I want to build it with you. I have thought about this every day for 6 months, and the thinking has not changed the wanting. I'm asking you to marry me, and I'm not asking because of the bank note or the land or anything practical. I'm asking because every morning I wake up thinking about the day ahead and you're in it, and every evening when I ride home I'm already making plans to come back. I am asking because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I would like to spend the rest of my life in the vicinity of that remarkableness." Annie looked at him for a long time. Outside, the May wind moved through the new grass, and somewhere a nighthawk was calling its repetitive clear note against the darkening sky. "You lost that auction on purpose," she said. He smiled. "I did. Nobody knew but me." "Nobody," he agreed. "Why didn't you tell me sooner about knowing that I knew?" "Because I wanted you to bring it up when you were ready," he said, "not before." She understood this completely, the patience of it, the respect in it, the absolute refusal to use even the knowledge of his own generosity as leverage. She understood it, and the understanding moved through her chest like the first warmth of a fire in a cold room. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with that expression she had come to know as his most unguarded, the one that made him look younger and softer and completely, helplessly glad. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said again, more firmly, with all the certainty she had spent 8 months building. "Dexter Fletcher, I will marry you." He crossed the porch to her in 2 steps and took both her hands and looked at her in the May moonlight with an expression she was going to remember for the rest of her life. And then he kissed her, thoroughly and without his usual careful restraint, and she kissed him back with equal thoroughness. And the nighthawk called again outside, and the grass moved in the warm wind, and the stars were enormous and indifferent over the panhandle, and none of that mattered at all. Charlie's reaction the following morning was to sit across the breakfast table, read both their faces with the systematic attention he applied to cattle, and say, "I already knew you were going to." He returned to his biscuit. Annie and Dexter exchanged a look of complete helplessness, and then both broke into laughter, and Charlie shook his head at the incomprehensibility of adults. They were married in redemption on the 12th of June, 1879, exactly 1 year and 1 week after the auction that had started it. Reverend Hollis performed the ceremony in the small church on the east side of town, which had been built 2 years after the first saloon, and smelled of pine resin and fresh whitewash. Mabel Foss stood up for Annie, and a man named Pete Dawson, who had been Dexter's closest friend since the Drover days, stood up for Dexter. And Charlie sat in the front pew in his good shirt and his expression of serious satisfaction, and held his mother's shawl and the rings until they were needed. Annie wore a dress she and Mabel had made together over 3 evenings in May, a deep blue cotton with white buttons at the collar, and she wore her hair down for the first time since James's funeral, the dark auburn of it catching the light through the church windows. Dexter, in his good jacket and a white shirt he had clearly spent considerable effort finding, stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him with an expression that made Mabel Foss press her handkerchief to her eyes and made Pete Dawson study the ceiling with studied manliness. The ceremony was brief and entirely sincere, and when Reverend Hollis pronounced them married, Dexter kissed her in the church for the first time in his life, and the handful of Redemption residents who had crowded the pews, Redemption being the kind of town where a wedding was a social event of consequence, made an appreciative sound. And Charlie said, "Finally," at a volume that was technically meant to be a whisper and failed at it, and laughter filled the small pine-scented church, and the day was perfect. They had the reception on the grounds of the Arrowhead, because the Arrowhead had more room than Annie's half-built house, and by mid-afternoon there were tables with food that half the county had contributed, and there was music from a fiddle player whose name was Rodrigo, and who could play anything that had ever been played on a fiddle. And there was dancing in the flat space by the barn until the stars came out, and the children fell asleep in various corners, and the adults drank Mabel's excellent applejack, and told each other the kind of frank, affectionate things that are only said at weddings. Pete Dawson found Dexter behind the barn where he had gone for 5 minutes of quiet and said, "How long did you know?" And Dexter said, "About her." And Pete said, "The auction." And Dexter said, "From the moment she raised her paddle." Pete said, "You gave up a good bull." Dexter said, "I got a considerably better trade." Pete looked at him for a long moment and said, "You're disgustingly happy." And Dexter agreed that this was accurate, and they went back to the dancing. Annie danced with Dexter until her feet ached, and then sat at the edge of the firelight with Mabel and watched him dance with Charlie, teaching the boy some complicated footwork that Charlie was mastering with characteristic serious determination. The firelight moved over both of them, her husband and her son, and she felt the fullness of it, the extraordinary specific weight of a life that had been very difficult for a long time and was now genuinely joyful. "Well," Mabel said beside her, with the satisfaction of a woman who has watched a thing she hoped for come to pass. "Well," Annie agreed. They merged the two operations gradually through the summer of 1879, a process of practical integration that was also a kind of courtship of its own, the merging of two established ways of doing things into a single working system. They moved Annie and Charlie to the Arrowhead in July, because the Arrowhead house was fully built and had 3 rooms and a kitchen with a proper stove, and because the Carver land could now be worked from the Arrowhead as a contiguous range that gave them together more than twice what either had managed alone. Harmon Cole sent one more letter in August, still through the banker Pritchard, inquiring about the availability of the Carver quarter section. Annie replied in her own handwriting, on the Arrowhead's headed paper that Dexter had ordered from a printer in Abilene, that the Carver Quarter section was not for sale and was now part of the Arrowhead Ranch, and signed it Annie Carver Fletcher. She showed the letter to Dexter before sending it, and he read it and said, "That'll do it," with a quiet satisfaction that matched her own. Cole did not write again. The Hereford Cross calves went to market in late August of 1879 and returned $812. Annie walked out of the bank in Caldwell having paid off the last of James's note with $400 to spare, and she stood in the September sunshine and felt, very specifically, the closing of a long, difficult chapter. She had done it. She had held the land through the hardest year of her life, through frost and grief and harm and coal, and a banknote she had no business thinking she could survive. And she had done it with a bull she'd bought on pure nerve, and a neighbor who had, for reasons of his own, decided to lose. She told Dexter about the payoff that evening on the Arrowhead porch, and he nodded and said, "I knew you'd make it," with a certainty that she understood he had always had, and she loved him for the constancy of it, for never having doubted even when she had. The following spring, 1880, brought 23 calves from Captain's second season with the herd, and a development that Annie announced to Dexter on a March evening after Charlie had gone to bed, in a voice that was composed and slightly uncertain in the way she only allowed herself to be with him. She was expecting a child. Dexter was very still for a moment, and then he pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that held within it a quality of wonder she found deeply moving, and he held her for a long time without saying anything, and when he did speak his voice was rough. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm perfectly well." "Good," he said. "That's the important thing." And then, after a moment, "I'm very glad." "So am I," she said. Charlie received the news the following morning with a brief considering silence and then said, "I'd like a brother," with the same tone he used when requesting specific items at the store. Annie said she would see what she could do. Charlie said that he hoped they would consult the matter carefully, because one sister would be acceptable, but two would create a serious imbalance. Dexter managed not to laugh for approximately 4 seconds. The summer of 1880 was the summer that redemption grew. The railroad had been coming closer for 2 years, and in August the tracks reached a junction 15 miles east that changed the economics of cattle ranching in Caldwell County overnight. Where before cattle had to be driven north on the Kisham Trail to Abilene or south to San Antonio, now they could be loaded east directly from the county, cutting 2 weeks and significant weight loss off the process, and returning considerably more per head at market. Dexter had anticipated this. He had been quietly increasing the Arrowhead's herd and improving his breeding stock for 2 years with this in mind. And the first fall shipment from the new railhead returned more money per animal than either of them had ever seen from cattle at market. Annie, who had been managing the Arrowhead's accounts with the same meticulous attention she had always brought to her own, spread the numbers on the kitchen table and looked at them with the satisfaction of a person whose calculations have been confirmed. "We're going to be all right," she said. "We were always going to be all right," Dexter said. "You couldn't have known that for certain," she said. "No," he admitted, "but I was going to make sure of it regardless." She looked at him, this man who had built himself up from nothing by relentless, deliberate effort, who had lost a bull on purpose for reasons he had taken 6 months to put into words, who had waited for her with a patience that never felt like patience, because it was simply the honest rhythm of who he was. She reached across the account books and took his hand. The baby arrived on the 14th of November, 1880, in the Arrowhead house with Mabel Foss in attendance as midwife, a position she had held for half the births in the northern county for the past 8 years. It was a boy, as Charlie had requested, and he was born healthy and loud, and with a look of outraged inconvenience that made Mabel laugh and Dexter stand at the bedside with an expression of complete stunned joy. Annie held her son and looked at Dexter across the small, warm bundle, and the November wind was outside, and the fire was going, and Charlie was sitting on the other side of the door in the hallway, because Mabel had told him to stay there during the difficult parts. And when Mabel opened the door and said it was done, and it was a boy, Charlie came in with the solemnity of a person greeting a serious development, and stood by the bed and looked at his brother with an expression of deep, proprietary satisfaction. "Hello," Charlie said to the baby. "My name is Charlie. I'm going to teach you about cattle." "He'll also teach him everything else," Annie said to Dexter, who was laughing quietly and wiping his eyes in the manner of a man who would have denied crying and been incorrect. They named him Thomas James Fletcher, Thomas for no one in particular except that it suited him, and James for Annie's first husband, because Dexter had suggested it himself, unprompted, and the suggestion had been the most generous thing anyone had ever done for her in a life that had seen considerable generosity. She had cried then, which was not something she did in front of people, and Dexter had held her without comment, and that was that. The Arrowhead grew through the early 1880s with the steady expansion of a well-managed operation in a good cattle country at the right moment in history. The railroad changed everything, as Annie had understood it would. By 1882, Dexter had added 4 sections of range and brought on 2 full-time hired hands, a young man named Walter who had come up from San Antonio with good horsemanship and a willingness to work, and an older hand named Joseph, who had been a freedman after the war and had spent 15 years drifting between cattle outfits before Dexter offered him stable work and consistent wages and decent treatment, which was not as common as it should have been, and which Dexter provided without ceremony or self-congratulation, because he believed it was simply the correct way to behave. Charlie, at 11 years old, was already doing the work of a grown hand when school and weather allowed, with the natural authority of a boy who had been thinking seriously about cattle for 4 years and retained everything he had ever learned about them. He had also appointed himself Thomas's primary educator on matters of ranching philosophy, and Thomas, who at 2 years old was absorbing language with enormous appetite, could already say bull and heifer and fence post and auction with reasonable clarity. The August auction of 1882 was the largest Redemption had seen. The new rail connection had attracted buyers from Fort Worth and even one from Kansas City, and the quality of stock being moved through the yard reflected the improved breeding programs that the Hereford and Shorthorn bulls of recent years had produced. Dexter went with his 4 best steers, and Annie went with 4 Hereford cross heifers from Captain's 3rd and final season. Captain had retired to an honored pasture existence the previous winter, and Annie had acquired a younger Hereford bull named Commodore, a name Charlie had selected on grounds of rank and advancement. They stood together at the fence of the auction yard in the August heat, Charlie between them and Thomas on Dexter's shoulders, and Annie watched the bidding on the first heifer go up past 250 with the calm professional satisfaction of someone who has been correct in their assessments. Beside her, Dexter leaned down and said quietly, 300 easy. 320, Annie said. He considered. 315. The hammer came down at 318, and Annie looked up at him with the expression that 4 years of marriage had given her the ease to produce freely, open and warm and entirely private, and he smiled his full unguarded smile, and Thomas, from his perch on Dexter's shoulders, said, cow, with great enthusiasm at a different animal entirely. In the fall of 1882, Pete Dawson came through Redemption on his way north and spent a week at the Arrowhead. He was still a drover, still moving up and down the diminishing but not yet finished cattle trails, and he sat on the Arrowhead porch in the evenings and talked with Dexter and Annie and watched the house and the yard and the easy completeness of the life that had been built there. And on his last evening he said to Dexter, without particular sentiment because Pete Dawson was not a sentimental man, "You did good, Dex." "I know it," Dexter said. "The bull," Pete said. "The bull," Dexter agreed. Annie, who was within earshot because she was always within earshot of conversations she was not officially invited to, looked up from the mending she was doing by the lamp and met Dexter's eyes and said nothing, which communicated everything. Pete looked between them and said, "Am I missing something?" "No," they said, in a single voice, and Pete shook his head and went to bed. The winter of 1882 brought the first real snow Redemption had seen in 4 years. Several inches that covered the panhandle in an uncharacteristic white silence for 2 days before the Chinook wind came through and melted it into the grateful ground. Charlie and Thomas built a snowman in the yard the first morning. Or Charlie built it and Thomas contributed one enthusiastically placed piece of grass, and then ate snow until Annie redirected him. Dexter and Annie stood at the kitchen window watching and drank their coffee while the steam rose into the cold window glass, and it was an ordinary moment of the most extraordinary kind, the kind that does not announce itself as significant but becomes, in memory, one of the images a life is made of. "I've been thinking," Dexter said, watching Charlie show Thomas how to pack snow. "About what?" Annie said. "About the north pasture. If we run the fence line another quarter-mile east, we can access the creek through the winter without moving the herd." She considered this. "That's a long fence run." "Worth it," he said. "Joseph and Walter can do it in 2 weeks. What about the cost?" "I've got it in the accounts." She leaned against the counter and looked at him, this man who was simultaneously planning fence lines and watching his sons in the snow with an expression that did not require any of the careful composure she had initially needed to read on his face. She knew his face now the way she knew the arrowhead's land, every contour and quality of light on it, every small change that meant something. "Do it," she said. "It's a good idea." He looked at her. "I'll start the orders this week." "Dexter," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad you lost that auction." The full smile came immediately, the one he had never relearned to contain in her presence. "I know," he said. "So am I." Outside, Charlie was attempting to explain to Thomas the structural engineering principles of snowman construction, using words that Thomas was approximately 18 months short of understanding. But Thomas was nodding seriously anyway, which was, Annie had observed, already a family trait. The years that followed were the years of building, in the truest sense. The Arrowhead grew into one of the strongest small operations in Caldwell County, known for the quality of its Hereford breeding stock and the fair dealing of its owners. Dexter's reputation for honest trade had always been part of his character, and Annie's practical intelligence and her meticulous accounts had sharpened the operation into something that could weather the inevitable bad years. The drought of 1883 that cut the calf crop by 1/3, the winter kill of 1885 that cost them 12 head, and still come out ahead because they had planned for the bad years always. Thomas grew into a boy very much his own person, loud where Charlie was quiet, quick to laugh where Charlie considered, with Dexter's dark eyes and Annie's stubborn jaw, and a particular gift for charming horses that manifested so early and so completely that Walter, who was the Arrowhead's most accomplished horseman, started teaching him in earnest when he was 4 years old. In the spring of 1885, Annie realized she was expecting their second child, and this time Dexter received the news with less of the stunned quality and more of the immediate deep gladness, pulling her close in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with the coffee still on the stove and saying into her hair, "I hope it's a girl this time." She laughed. "Charlie will object. Charlie is 15. He can manage an objection. Thomas will be confused." "Thomas will ride the horse and work out the rest later," Dexter said, which was an accurate assessment of Thomas Fletcher's approach to most things. The girl arrived in December of 1885, in the same bedroom of the Arrowhead house, where Thomas had arrived 5 years before, again with Mabel Foss in attendance. Mabel was 61 years old and still the most capable midwife in the northern county, and she delivered the baby with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who has done a difficult thing enough times to make it look easy. The baby was healthy and had, unmistakably, Annie's green eyes, which was reported by Mabel to the waiting household with the specific detail she knew would be appreciated. Charlie received the news of a sister with mature acceptance. Thomas received it with the question of whether she could ride horses yet, and the answer of not for several years, and the follow-up question of whether the horse could come and meet her instead. Dexter stood at the bedside and looked at his daughter for a long time, and then he looked at Annie, and what was on his face was something she was going to keep for the rest of her life like a pressed flower between pages, something that age and difficulty and the ordinary hard years of living had not reduced in the slightest but only intensified. They named her Clara Mabel Fletcher, the Mabel being Mabel Foss's, because neither of them had needed to discuss it. Mabel received this information the following morning and said, "Oh, goodness," and pressed her handkerchief to her face, and then said none of that to herself and went to make tea, which was her response to any emotional event she considered excessive. Redemption itself was changing through the 1880s, becoming less the rough frontier town it had been in 1878 and more the established community of a maturing region. The church had been expanded. A school had been built, a proper one, where Charlie had been among the first students, and now Thomas attended with the seriousness of a boy who had been taught at home by a mother who did not take education casually. There was a second general store and a telegraph office and a doctor who had trained in St. Louis and brought with him opinions about hygiene that the older residents found alarming. The injustices of the time were not invisible to Annie and Dexter. They were aware of what happened to the freedmen and freedwomen who tried to build lives in the region, the constant pressure and hostility they faced, the ways the law was applied unevenly, and the ways it was not applied at all when it should have been. Dexter paid Joseph the same wages as Walter and had from the beginning, and when a man at the Caldwell auction made a remark in 1883 about this being unusual, Dexter had looked at him steadily and said, "Joseph does the same work. He gets the same pay," with a finality that closed the conversation. Annie had seen it happen and had felt again that particular quality of respect for her husband that had been part of her love for him since nearly the beginning. They could not change the world they lived in. They could change the piece of it they inhabited. The Kishom Trail, that great artery of the cattle trade that had made Dexter's early life and the lives of thousands of men like him, went quiet through the mid-1880s as the railroad spread south, and the fencing of the ranges reduced the open country that trail drives required. The era of the long drive was closing, and Redemption, like many towns of its kind, was finding its new shape in the settled ranch country rather than the transient cattle trade. Dexter watched the old era pass without sentimentality, having been part of it and understood it clearly. He had been a drover. He had been young on the trail, and he had taken from it what it had to offer and built something with it, and the something was better than the trail. He said as much to Charlie one evening in 1886, when Charlie was 16 and talking about going north on a drive for the summer experience of it, and Dexter told him what the drives were actually like. The river crossings and the lightning strikes and the weeks of monotony and the constant smell of cattle and the exhaustion that settled into a man's bones and did not leave, and told him also that the experience was not without value, that there was something a young man learned from that kind of sustained endurance that he could not learn easily elsewhere. Charlie went that summer and returned in the fall with a thoroughness of experience on his face that had not been there in June, and he sat at the supper table the first evening home and ate 3 servings of Annie's beef stew and said almost nothing, and Annie watched her son across the table and understood that he had gone out a boy and come back, not quite yet a man but very close to the threshold of it. Thomas, at 6, watched his brother across the table with enormous admiring eyes and said, "Tell me everything," and Charlie, after a long pause, began to talk. The August auction of 1887 was the Arrowhead's best year. Dexter drove 17 head to Caldwell, and came home with a check that Annie received and recorded in the account books with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose calculations have, once again, been confirmed. They were prosperous. Not wealthy by the standards of the great ranching empires that were already consolidating in the region, but solidly, genuinely prosperous in the way that felt earned, because it was. That evening after supper, after Thomas and Clara were asleep, and Charlie had retired to the room he used when he was home from the increasing frequency of his own work on a neighboring spread where he was hired as a hand, and doing the kind of growing up that was best done away from home, Dexter and Annie sat on the Arrowhead porch in the August dark with their coffee growing cold, and the stars were out in the quantity that the panhandle sky produced on clear nights, which was excessive. "It's been 9 years," Dexter said. "Since the auction," Annie said. "Since the auction," he agreed. She looked at him in the dark. "Do you remember exactly what you were thinking?" "When you put the paddle down," he considered. "I remember thinking that you needed the bull more than I did." "That's practical," she said. "I also remember thinking that you were the most interesting person who had ever bid against me at an auction," he said. She smiled. "That's not very high competition." "No," he agreed. "But it was true, and I remember thinking," he paused, and she let him take his time as she always did. "I remember thinking that I wanted to know what happened next. For you, whatever came next, I wanted to know how it came out." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, something, an owl, perhaps, called once from the direction of the cottonwoods along the creek. "You know," she said. "Now I know," he said. He looked at her with his dark, steady eyes in the dark porch. "I'd say it came out well. We worked for it," she said. "We did," he agreed. "Both of us." She reached over and took his hand the way she had first taken it, almost touching, in the wagon on the road back from Caldwell in October of 1878, and this time she held it fully, fingers folded together, the warm, familiar weight of it, and he turned his hand to hold hers back. The owl called again. The cottonwoods moved. The Arrowhead lay quiet around them. The good smell of cattle and hay, and the particular dry sweetness of late summer grass. And the house was full of sleeping children, and the evidence of the life they had made together. And Annie Carver Fletcher sat on her porch under the panhandle stars and thought about a June morning in 1878, and a woman in a faded calico dress, and a man who had put his paddle down, and how the whole shape of everything had turned on that single quiet moment of choosing. And how that was both extraordinary and exactly how it should be. "Dexter," she said. "Annie," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for the auction." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very softly, "Thank you for bringing back the $5. She laughed, and the laugh carried out into the August dark and scattered away into the enormous, indifferent, beautiful Texas night. And Dexter squeezed her hand, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat there together on their porch in the last good warmth of summer, and it was exactly, precisely, entirely enough. They did not move for a long time. The stars moved overhead through their vast, slow arc, and the Arrowhead settled into the quiet sounds of a working ranch in the night. And somewhere Thomas turned over in his sleep and said one word clearly, "Horses." And they both heard it and both smiled without speaking. And Clara made the small, certain sound of a baby in a deep and comfortable sleep. And the whole world was contained in the warm circle of that porch. And nothing was unfinished, and nothing was open. And everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built. And Dexter Fletcher and Annie Carver Fletcher sat together in the August dark of 1887, and were, completely and without reservation, home.